there are a number of ethical positions or ideologically based movements in which participants or people who pose themselves as spokespeople, in a sense, for that engage in a kind of stance that leads towards a more skeptical, that has a more skeptical nature to it, is generally not welcomed by the vast majority of the more hardline advocates and spokespeople for the movement. And I would certainly consider antinatalism and antinatalism to be such movements in which the aforementioned is mostly unwelcome. Because they have, for the most part, as I've observed, a very binary stance on the matter. And I think it's perfectly justifiable and understandable. Because it is such a critical and crucial thing that they are trying to achieve, and the consequences of not achieving that are so dire in their view. And I would certainly concur that they are. But nonetheless, it seems to be a lot of what's coming to my mind for ideas, things to talk about, contain a considerable kernel of devil's advocacy. I don't know, maybe it's just the way that I think. Just being kind of skeptical of my own conclusions. So perhaps, even though I would consider myself aligned quite thoroughly, at least in a sense, with antinatalism and antinatalism, respectively, it may help if you're someone considering aligning themselves with this philosophy, and more broadly the movement as a whole, becoming yourself an advocate of it, to not perhaps consider me to be one. because I do recognize that for someone who is inherently opposed to it, they would use the things that I was saying as justifications for their own complacency and ignorance, ultimately. So yeah, I don't know. Maybe this is a terrible idea to even discuss these things, but I feel like, well, I mean, it's like a lot of things, really, isn't it? It's a tool, and it can be used responsibly by people who are capable of using it responsibly, and for people who aren't, it can be quite destructive. So I don't know, whatever. I'll put this out here anyway. And it's concerning, of course, this idea, as you can tell from the title, of the relative and the absolute. And perhaps this is not a legitimate topic for serious discussion, and more just a kind of an illustration of the corruption of my own sort of rationality, really, by certain pseudo philosophies that I've been exposed to. Most apparently, I would say, the whole Advaita non-duality scene that I sort of briefly mentioned in one of the earlier videos. Yeah, and you can, if you have any knowledge whatsoever of it, that you would know that the very language of the whole relative and absolute thing is very much part and parcel of that that topic. So I suppose I'll just begin by saying that from the way I see it from the relative perspective, which is to define the terms as I see them, from the relative perspective, which is yeah, see, this is where it gets real fuzzy, and it's where you sort of recognize that you're probably slightly more than full of shit, but so I would define the relative perspective for the purpose of this discussion as being the immediate, lived, human-centric experience. So that is, I suppose, what one would most readily fall into as a framework of experience without any deliberate exertion to the contrary. So, it would just be without engaging any sort of extracurricular thought, like meta thought about one's situation and one's place within the greater scheme of things. I don't know if that makes any sense. It's very abstract, but it makes sense to me. And so the absolute would be, well, it would be to the perspective that would be afforded to one through engaging in some of the things that I just mentioned. So like metacognition, essentially, looking at one's position from outside of one's position, through engaging in sort of more complex thinking, beyond the, I suppose, banality of day-to-day life, and the banal demands that it places upon one's thinking processes. And so, because from the absolute perspective, that entails sort of, like existential contemplation also, I would say. And if one is doing that in an honest way, I would say, it is of course going to, not necessarily of course, but at least from how I have experienced it and how I have seen many other people experience it, it leads one to a kind of understanding of the ultimately unknowability of one's situation in the broadest, most sense possible. And of course, in a complete unknowability, there can be no firm meaning or really even value, because attendant to that unknowability, that a sort of more immediate psychological state is engendered in which there is a sense of absurdity, I guess, and I would say that absurdity kind of erases value. Which I know most probably the immediate rebuttal to that would be that what about in states of extreme suffering? Does absurdity erase the value of that? Can one be completely indifferent to suffering when they are in the midst of the state of absurdity? Can holding one ameliorate or altogether obliterate the experience of the other absurdity to suffering? And I suppose this is the sort of the crux of what I wanted to get to. Because this is really for myself that I feel this tension with this fully marrying myself to this antinatalist position. This is the one thing that sort of there's this tension with, because I can engage a state of absurdity. It is, for a large part, a state in which I find myself. Yeah, I mean, I see the problem with even discussing this from a hardline antinatalist perspective. It's very, yeah, it is kind of corrosive, and it undermines the objectives of antinatalism. But it is something that I personally see as something of a roadblock. But it's really, I suppose it could be kind of reduced to a tension between, I mean, really it's a tension between the left brain and the right brain, right? It's sort of the logical and more intuitive, emotional sides of the human being coming head to head with one another. That would be from a logical perspective. I would come to that conclusion. And of course, you know, from the other, I would come from the other. So, yeah, I don't know how much more I can flesh that out. Maybe I'll come back to this at some other point, but yeah, I don't know if I've elaborated that enough to have it make any kind of sense to anyone else, but I would be interested to see what anyone else has to say about this. I'm sure the hardliners will shoot me down, especially more atheistic types, but yeah, I don't know. Interested to see what you think, if you think anything at all.